Chapter 351. Lara. Put me down. Lannister yelled, shocked at how rude this girl was. Lannister knew he hadn't done anything wrong, and he wasn't a lawbreaker either. Perhaps she was protecting this world. It was immediately obvious he was in another world, but sadly, it seemed this one had been claimed already. As for sentient floating weapons, he dismissed that idea. The girl didn't answer, but she was close enough to analyze, and using her name he spoke slowly, but sternly. Lara, I leave peacefully. Just put me down, and I'll go. Lannister said, his frown turning into anger. The warning in his voice was clear. In response, the side of Lara's lip curled, mocking him as she looked down. She wasn't concerned with the danger he posed. In fact, she wanted him to try something. She welcomed it. It would hone her skills further. Lannister sighed, his face softened, seemingly giving up. While he floated under her, he held one hand behind his body, forming a tiny portal. I'm sorry, he said, shrugging. Twisting his body, he shot his fist into the hidden portal. Crack. The other end of the portal led to the side of Lara's head. She rocked her head and her body flipped. Both of them lost concentration and fell, the gravity magic giving up without her. Lannister landed on the roots, bruising his shoulder. Lara fell from much higher though, but before she collided with him, a large portal appeared, right above Lannister. She slipped right into it, then nearby another portal spat her out, sending her upwards. It was a small act of mercy to shoot her upwards from the second portal, diminishing some of her speed before she would hit the ground. Lannister preferred to slip away rather than to fight, and the latter was more likely if she came looking for retribution. Besides, he felt bad for sneak attacking her. Lara flew out of the portal, but before she even touched the ground she regained her senses, floating again and looking for her target. Lannister still had his arms up, closing the portals he just opened. They locked eyes. Lara huffed and sped towards him, but before her gravity magic could take effect he already bolted away. The gravity magic took effect, but all too slowly. A portal swirled into existence and Lannister began to glide through, already weightless as he entered it, but having enough momentum to make it. Yet Lara was faster. She kicked off tree trunks and pulled herself forward with her own gravity. Lara had never lost a fair 1-versus-1, and she wasn't going to let a stranger without an academy uniform beat her, especially since she just became the #1 duelist among the first years. NEO v Euros Raptor marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. Sure, this wasn't a typical duel, but seeing a student prowling around without an academy uniform meant they were up to no good. She darted towards him. Only Lannister's legs stuck out of the portal, but Lara was still 30 feet away. She wouldn't make it in time. GH. She kicked off another tree, 15 feet. His knees were already gone, only his boots stuck out. She was losing him. Lara grit her teeth. Her pride fueled her. She wasn't going to let him escape. Instead of slowing down in the face of an unknown portal which could lead anywhere, she did the unthinkable and pushed herself forward, speeding towards it faster. Lannister's boot disappeared just as her hand grasped toward it. Her speed created a violent ripple as she shot into the portal. She felt his boot on the other side and grasped it, refusing to let go. Oh, come on. Lannister looked back, shocked that she followed him through. Lannister couldn't close his portal, not with someone inside, and Lara came crashing into him. The two of them tumbled in each other's embrace, both rolling down the edge of the grassy hill, trampling flowers as they went. Ugh, just let me go. Lannister grunted, pushing her away. No. Why should I? You attacked me. We have order here, you know. I was just defending myself. Get off. Lannister yelled and with a grunt pushed her away as they rolled. Lara went further downhill. He hastily formed another portal behind her and pushed her in, but Lara flicked her wrist right back. A jolt of gravity pulled him down, into the portal with her. F-ah. Lannister screamed. Then, weightlessness. Blue surrounded them. The portal opened in the sky, spitting them both out above the clouds, both of them dropping like stones. Lara scoffed, do you think this would kill me? You know I can fly. The wind roared past their ears, forcing them both to yell. I wasn't trying to kill you. I was just trying to go home. Lannister yelled. Lara's expression softened. Home. Her angered brows gave way to a gleam of sadness in her eyes as she began to float, stopping her fall while she watched Lannister plummet below. Home, she whispered, feeling as empty as the sky she was in. Lara looked down, watching him fall. His clothes slapped and flapped through the whistling air. She waited for him to make another portal, intent on letting him escape. It was not a surprise to her that someone would want to leave the mirror reality to go home, to rekindle with their own families and loved ones if the mage hunters hadn't dashed them to pieces already anyway. Thinking that he was going to see his family, Lara rolled her tongue in her cheek with a pang of jealousy. I think you should take a look at. Idiot. She murmured, watching him enter the clouds, letting herself descend after him at a more controlled speed. Lannister's body cut through the cloud, beginning to turn to a darkened blob, fading. But seeing his arms begin to flail around, Lara raised a brow. Go on, just escape already. Portal away. She thought, tilting her head he hadn't disappeared yet. Her eyes widened and she took a breath. Whoosh. She reversed gravity, instantly falling faster than she even had. Combining the natural gravity with her own, she became a speeding bolt of lightning. The air roared against her, threatening to tear her skin and blind her, feeling like it was burning. Lannister had already disappeared into the forest of clouds. Lara rushed through right after him, streaking through the mist and out the other side in an instant, land below. She saw Lannister. In his hands he held an old coat which he barely gripped, using it like a parachute. But at this speed it wouldn't be enough. The ground seemed so far away, but so close as it quickly filled her vision. Lara sped down and the horizon rose around her. The green sea of forest canopy became clear, and each tree began to stand out from the rest. He didn't even see her coming. Lannister. She screamed, but doubted her voice would reach him. It was impossible to push air out at these speeds. She reached down, grasping at him like he were about to escape through another portal. She pushed into his stupid parachute. He was in her reach again. Whoosh. Ah. She crashed onto his stupid old coat and hit his shoulder. They tumbled as she forced them together and grappled with his body. A few spins of their bodies in flailing hands, Lara found herself grabbing him by the leg again, and hugged his knee tightly. The ground was spreading out as they sped towards it. Lara released all the gravity magic she could, forcing herself upwards, bear-hugging Lannister's leg, who was upside down. When seconds mattered it was easier to use her own magic on herself, instinctive. But he began to slide out of her grip, his clothes tearing. The wind still whistled dangerously past. GH. Come on. Lara grit her teeth, fighting gravity in her own muscles, trying to keep her grip on his leg. He slipped down to the foot, and her muscles screamed at her to release, her shoulders feeling like they would rip from the joints. But she held on, even as her fingernails dug into his leg and ripped away. Crack. A branch snapped into them, Lannister taking the brunt. Lara ignored the leaves rushing past and heaved, squeezing him tighty and using one last desperate burst of gravity to slow them. The branches snapped against them, flicking past like whips, but in the next moment, they stopped. Without warning they hit the ground. Thud. Both of them impacted. A kick of dust and leaves flushed away from the gust. The pain was numbing. She felt nothing, but didn't dare to move. At least not until her body forced her to, which it did. Lara coughed, spitting blood. She weakly moaned, chest filled with broken bones, but alive. She leaned her head back and breathed for a moment, trying to get a breath in, followed by another, then the next. Each breath was a challenge, a struggle. The pain would last a while until her health drained and their adventurer bodies healed themselves. A little while passed. She could do nothing but endure the pain and watch the wind shifting the leaves above, and she began to count up all the branches and twigs they snapped away on the way down. About 30 in total. It was a miracle they didn't hit any of the thicker log-like arms jutting out from these giant trees, each enormous like primordial giants standing against time itself. He even thought they were copies in the mirror reality. They were just as proud as their real-life counterparts. The pain began to leave, but her bones still ached, but Lara felt something else. Lannister had been holding onto her foot as much as she held onto his, her own boot already slipped off. Finally, she heard something. A teacher was coming. Lara closed her eyes, relaxing and letting them handle the rest, fading as she heard the junior headmistress. Lara, get them to the infirmary now, head wound, help him first. Chapter 352. Follower. Boom. A giant block of earth crashed in a roof, plummeting through it with ease. A small wooden house at the mercy of Lara's magic. The roof sunk and splintering bits of wood shot out of the debris. A low groan resounded from the depths of the house, then a moment later blood seeped through the windows and flowed under the front door. Lara nodded to herself, seeing that her guess was correct. The house itself was a living mimic, a gut-filled mess of organs and teeth filled its insides, while the outside looked like a perfectly inviting house to come into, and it waited for an unwary adventurer to step inside. The mimics were magic immune, but these large slow-moving targets were an easy monster for Lara's projectiles. To her, it was hardly training. She was merely grinding exp, giving her body the rest it needed. In a few hours, a week had passed since the incident, the incursion of Lannister into the mirror reality, and then the skyfall that wounded both of them. After recovering from the fall, Lara had been training diligently for the upcoming Academy tournament, ignoring her body's calls to slow down. Every time she moved, the bruising of her sore bones grown back, a reminder of the damage she caused herself. Normally her duels in the arena prevented injuries and most of the pain, and she'd forgotten just how painful wounds could be, just how fragile life was even with a class. Each strain of her muscle weighed on her mind, distracting her own monocraft, and each time she crushed a mimic her thoughts kept drifting back to Lannister, who still lay in an infirmary bed, unmoving. The skyfall reduced Lannister's health to 0, his body absorbing the rest of the damage, which could be permanent, if not for the hasty healing of the infirmary classes and other tricks of the variants. But he still hadn't woken up. Lara didn't understand why she kept thinking about him. She wanted to fight him again, but there was something else, something that made her want to hide her face. But instead of exploring those thoughts, she shook her head, trying not to think about it. Lara meagerly trudged through the dungeon, tiredly skipping rocks at whatever large, out-of-place thing she saw, sending something larger than a stone if it moved, but after a weary sigh, she lowered her head and left the dungeon. Slowly walking back to her dorm, a voice came to her ears. "Lara." Lannister woke up. "He wants to speak to you," Evelyn said, and Lara quickly pulled out the communication crystal, stopping her walk and staring at it, grasped tightly in her fingers. She paused for a moment before replying. "What? Why me?" Lara asked. Evelyn softly sighed. "Just come to the infirmary." Lara blinked at the crystal a few times, waiting for more information, but there was none, and she replied after a short silence. "I'm on my way," Lara said, and hurried to the Academy healing area. Lara wasn't sure what was going on, much less what to feel. Why was she being summoned? Was Lannister angry at her? Should she be angry at him or concerned? Did he die? He was an intruder, so she didn't feel like she was in the wrong here. Emerging from the sanctum of Novos Elest said N, this essence holds secrets untold. Lara guessed and assumed as she walked. Other than the fight, he has nothing to do with me. Do they think I let him in, or betrayed the Academy? Lara thought. She thought it was odd. In fact, it was inappropriate to bring her into his infirmary room. A hospital bed was still a personal bed after all, and she was a student without any healing magic. She wondered if there was punishment waiting, in case he did die. Lara knew her perfect record of duels she worked so hard for would sink into gray meaninglessness if she knew she took someone's life, not to mention the punishment for doing so. What enjoyment is there in prizes, merit, or badges when you have blood on your hands? Lara was certain there was none, and picked up her pace. Just outside the infirmary, a number of students had crowded around, causing a stir. All of them were trying to peek inside, while the more cunning insisted they were sick, and had to be brought in only to be rejected a moment later. None of them even noticed Lara coming until she passed by. Once they saw her, they made themselves small and stepped back quietly, showing a fearful respect for the first-year duel master. The caretaker nurse at the front desk eyed Lara up and down, and gave her a tired look. Another student trying to sneak in. "I think you should take a look at." "Hi. Evelyn told me to come here," Lara said. "Oh, did she? Well, let me call her," the nurse said, slowly pulling out a communication crystal, tapping them over it and watching Lara for a reaction. They both knew Evelyn would punish Lara if this was a lie. Yet Lara didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned on the desk and she glanced around the room, lazily picking details out. The nurse raised a brow, went ahead and made the call, and a moment later she glanced up at Lara with a look of shock on her face. Lara heard the last of the conversation. "She's the one. Okay, I'll send her through. Thanks, bye." The nurse put her crystal down and glanced up at Lara. "Hallway 6. Bed 11. The nurse said, pointing to a hallway behind her while looking down at some paperwork, trying to hide any embarrassment. 611. Thanks." Lara nodded and walked past into a long hallway. The hallway had a set of double doors at the end, both of them giving off a purple wavy hue, like a thick violet gas was clinging to its surface. However, as Lara walked closer, she slowed, feeling nauseous. Her vision split into doubles, seeing 2 sets of double doors. "Ah." She stopped, rubbing her head and her eyes. "Maybe I overdid it," she said to herself. She looked at her own hands, and the feeling disappeared instantly. Her vision was back to normal. She glanced up at the hallway doors again, but it was still like double vision. 2 sets of double doors. What, she whispered, holding her hand up while looking at the 2 sets of hallways behind it. Her hand wasn't doubled, but somehow the hallway had split into 2. Lara cautiously took a step forward, holding her hand up to make sure she didn't feel nauseous and wasn't going crazy. With each step she took, the hallways miraculously splintered, diverging before her very eyes like a kaleidoscope. Hundreds of them split, thousands appeared and disappeared. Then, as she approached, she noticed numbers above the sets of double doors. She stopped for a moment and read. 27,182. Lara raised a brow, and took a step to the left. 15,693. Then another, and she watched thousands of hallways flicker in and out of her vision in an instant. 10,542. No matter how many steps she took, she didn't touch the wall at her side, and the hallway numbers kept decreasing until it finally went down to the one what she wanted. Why were the students trying to see inside when we have this? Lara wondered and looked up, trying to find hallway 11. 11. Hallway 11, bed 6. She said with a nod, reminding herself as she slowly walked through the double doors. Behind the doors, the hallway continued for only about 50 yards, surprising Lara as she thought it would be as infinite as the number of halls. Rooms lined each wall, and she found the bed she was searching for under 5 to 8 sign. Evelyn was already waiting outside for her, tapping her heel. Evelyn didn't seem sad or grim, in fact, she seemed displeased. Lara wasn't sure if it was a good sign or not. Lara, hello. He wanted to talk to you. I think it's best that you have a chat with him, then we tell you what we'll be doing after. Evelyn said, gesturing her into the room. Talk to me. Okay. Lara said, her face expressionless. She was glad Lannister was alive, but had a feeling she was about to be punished. Chapter 353. Petals. Lara felt weight bearing down on her as she slowly stepped in, and thought one last time about the mimics she had just crushed as she entered the room. At this moment she felt like one of them, strong and perfect on the outside, but weak once the illusion shattered. Lara paused when hearing a nurse chatting to him at his bedside. She only heard the last of the conversation, but it seemed like they were convincing him to stop playing around with his portal magic. Lara frowned, clenched her fists, and walked around the curtain, but as she saw Lannister, only a wide smile greeted her back. Lara, he said, his eyes widening. Immediately, 2 portals formed at either side of him. He shot his arms into them, and Lara felt someone touching her shoulders. Lara tensed her shoulders. He's hugging me. What the fuck? Lara thought, her brows creasing in confusion. Lara stepped back, away from the disembodied floating arms coming from the portals. She thought he would look weak, small and pitifully pathetic in the hospital bed, but instead he seemed full of wonder and life. Instead, she was the one who felt weak, unable to lighten up, unable to smile. Why am I here? She said, glaring at Lannister in his hospital bed, but the nurse answered. You're the only one here, members. Lannister nodded with a smile, and took out the dagger with a leather grip. You, and my trusty dagger. He winked, showing the letter L engraved on the bottom. It was the same dagger Lara had attacked him with, the one he initially thought was a sentient creature. That's Lara said, but stopped herself. She didn't want them knowing she used a weapon to attack him in the first place. Lannister put that away. The nurse ordered, and he stashed it with a cheeky grin, looking up at Lara. So can we leave yet? Lannister asked. Lara raised a brow, wondering why he was asking her. The nurse explained. You're the only person he knows, so you'll need to take care of him. Lara opened her mouth, shocked, but before she could say something the nurse continued. Talk to Evelyn. The nurse ordered, pointing out the door, stopping Lara from saying anything or denying her duty to Lannister. Lara frowned, leaving through the door without a word. Having to babysit this moron was the last thing she thought would happen. Perhaps it was a punishment. Of course, she would protest, however, she didn't get a word in. Evelyn held her finger up as soon as she barged out the door, keeping Lara quiet. She made sure the door was shut before saying anything. Lara, we're going to keep him with us for now. His portal skills will be an asset, however, it seems he's got an attachment to you, so as the only person he knows, you're going to be responsible for him. I want you to monitor him and report any odd behavior. We have had him charmed and his memories searched, so he truly has forgotten everything since the moment he came here. If he does remember anything and he is a threat, don't engage him. Just contact me. Evelyn said, her eyes narrowing. Yep, it's a punishment. Lara thought. But I have the tournament coming up. I need to, Lara blurted, but Evelyn raised her hand. No. Evelyn shook her head. You're doing this. Look at it like an opportunity, a different sort of training, she said, then began to walk down the hallway. If you can't do this simple duty, forget about the tournament, she added, leaving Lara frowning by herself. I think you should take a look at. Lara clenched her fists, feeling trapped, and leaned against a wall, then smacked her hand against it. She took a moment to gather herself and went back into the room. Lannister smiled up at her from the bed and sat up, but Lara spoke first. How long till you're ready to leave? I don't know, Lannister said, scratching his chin and looking at the nurse, hoping for an answer. Lara sighed. I'll be back tomorrow morning to pick you up, she said, and glanced at the nurse who nodded back. Lara gave a single nod and left without another word. A few days later. Since leaving the infirmary, Lannister followed Lara around the academy, never leaving her side. Today they entered a dungeon, and Lara was already crushing enemies under whatever piece of rock or rubble she could find. But Lannister had concerns. Lara, they told us to meet at the assembly hall. NEOV Euros Ellust at 1N hosted the premiere release of this chapter. I don't care, I've got training to do. Just go by yourself, Lara said. The boulder hovered in front of her for a moment, and she pulled her hand down, crushing a writhing mess of barbed vines into green paste, before glancing over to Lannister. To her surprise, he still didn't leave. She thought he looked worried as nervously he rubbed his hands together, but after a moment he crouched down and sat by a few flowers, and began to trace his fingertips across their petals. He finally gave up, Lara thought. As he went silent, something felt wrong about crushing his spirit. Lara looked around the dungeon and saw no more enemies nearby, and sighed. Fine, let's go, she said, rolling her eyes. Lannister looked up with a smile. He seemed as naive as the flowers, but Lara knew that with some training, he would become a force to be reckoned with in his own right, but that didn't make him any less of a nuisance. Lara didn't understand where Lannister got his uptight rule-following attitude from. In the last few days he was like a little annoying fly that kept buzzing around her head, reminding her to follow the Academy's rules and instructions, most of which she previously ignored. It came with the privileges of being a prize combat class student. Instead of having him follow me, they really should give him orders to train with me. At the very least, Lara thought. Lannister left first, but Lara glanced at the flowers for a moment. It was something she hadn't noticed, or at least something she never bothered to look at. Lara crouched down and traced her fingers across the delicate flower tops, and gave them a smell. So easily crushed, she murmured, then left the dungeon, leaving the flowers in peace. Chapter 354. Presently. Present day, Higatha's floating swamp island. Jay cracked his eyes open with a smile, amused by two things he saw today from his time hosting in Sweeper's Eyes. This chapter was first shared on the NEOV Euros Ellust at 1N platform. He used all his willpower to stop himself from bursting into laughter when he saw Azra trying to pull away from Higatha's healing practice, pulling herself along the table. Jay pitied the young vampire, more so than when he found her in the vine bear's cocoon. And then there was the moment Higatha approached his cube bone room. The skeletons didn't need to give her any verbal warning, not that they could. All it took was for them to crouch into a combat stance and raise their weapons, and as he watched from Sweeper's Eyes, he could feel the fear that Higatha showed when she froze in her tracks before slowly and cautiously stepping back. Her face looked so shocked and she didn't even dare to take a breath in that moment. Ha ha. Jay chuckled, looking at his ceiling as he lay on his bed, replaying the events in his head. It was a welcomed release of tension, something he had built up in the last few days. At some points he felt like his life was fluid and chaotic, like everything was falling out from below him with every step he took, like the bone bridge he made, while other times his constructions and experimenting felt ordered but slow, like he was giving a set of hands the opportunity to slowly close around his neck. But this helped to set his mind at ease, at least for a moment, and he took a little while longer to relax, meditate, and replenish some of his mana. Jay sighed and sat up. All right, I have work to do, he said, but a voice greeted him back. Jay. Vision receptacle repaired. Continuing memory repair. A little voice said next to him. Jay glanced at his desk. The black stone orb he named Leech still sat in the small indentation he made on the desk. Hang on. Jay stood up, stretching his back. I need you to see these runes I copied. You said you could interpret runes. Yes. Current memory repaired 0.001%. Runic translation has been recovered. Leeches said, and a small triangle with a round hole slowly raised from its surface. Jay raised a brow and grabbed it, holding it to his face. Can you see me? Yes. What do I look like? Human. Male. Adolescent. Pale skin. Dark hair. Pale skin. Jay thought, shook his head, and turned it to face the runes he had scratched into his desk. What do these mean? Processing runes identified. Accessing templates. Processing portal. Mirror type. Resonance stabilized. Passive circulation. 2-point vertical linkage. Processing. Leech's eye closed back down into the cube, and Jay placed it back down on the desk. He stepped into the doorway and had a look outside. Archers in red diligently remained on guard. Red fervently stood at his door while archers patrolled around the outside, its body still a mix of gray-white and cobalt-blue bones of different shapes and sizes. After being summoned multiple times and with no other orders, it went on to guard duty. The bone well had dispersed the last of its mana from the mass summoning spell, and the once floating bones sat in a circle on the ground like the nest of an eldritch creature, next to the pile Red had been feeding it. Jay hastily stashed the bones away, and seeing little other changes outside, he went back inside and returned to Leech. So? He asked. The triangle rune is a single location. It requires another triangle rune to interact with, forming 2 points to relay the portal between. This specific triangle orientation is vertical, and only allows the corresponding portal location to be above or below, requiring 2 to fix a portal in a vertical location. So that's why the other 2 triangle shapes above the mirror portal were worn down. The mirror portal is directly above the other one, Jay thought. Leech continued, the other 7 runes help to form the portal shape, the reflective mirror portal type, to draw in the ambient mana to fuel it, and to stabilize it. In this configuration they must be arranged around the outside, in sets of no less than 4 for each side. More can be added to enlarge the mirror surface. These types of portal offer a practical application for short-range teleportation, and allow the user to see through to the other side before stepping through. This prevents the occurrence of matter entwining and... Okay, I get it. So it's not too hard to make, right? It is considered hard by novice runesmiths. The runes of the lower portal must be kept in perfect alignment with the upper one, so carving them into a single surface, such as a flat cliff face or a large stone, is often necessary. If either moves out of alignment, the portal will break. Also, the triangle runes must be carved at the same time. Furthermore, the portals must both be fueled with mana instantaneously to activate at the same time. This makes a runesmith's mimic tool a necessity in. Higatha probably used her leaves to help her carve somehow. But if she can do it, I can too. Jay murmured, but Leeches continued. Furthermore, as long as the portals are kept in vertical alignment, they can move up and down from each other, to an extent. However, its practicality offers little use in most settings, because as the distance increases, so does the likelihood of the portals moving out of alignment, and... Alright Leech, that's enough. Other than knocking down a wall, how do I disable the portal? The 3rd rune in each set of 7 needs to be removed. This erodes the resonance, causing the portal to collapse. Removed. Can I cut it or scratch it out? Yes. Alright. Go back to memory repair. Acknowledged. Jay leaned his hand over it and left it with some extra mana to absorb and thought to himself. If she is as bad as Azra thinks, maybe I can trap her underground and burn her house down. But I'll investigate further. He thought, and went outside to watch over his skeletons to pass the time while his mana recovered. The rest of the afternoon was quite dull. The hunting skeletons slayed more of the firelights, and returned with fresh sets of charred bones, bringing with them more of the amber-breaking shards and exp notifications. 430 exp. Jay ate more of his cooked meat, but began to get tired of constantly chewing it, and he rubbed his lower stomach, feeling his guts felt like they were going to be blocked soon. He wondered what else could be eaten, so he sent archers out to gather the various mushrooms. Everything in this swamp was vying for life, coated in thorns or poison, and he wasn't sure what was edible, so he decided he'd need to ask Higatha. But there was another option. Perhaps Azra could test the mushrooms. She seems resilient enough. He thought, and watched as an assortment of as for the light it gave off. Jay wasn't worried about it attracting any threats. The fog was a shield, as much as it was a curtain hiding multicolored fungus began to pile up, some of which were wet. That archers gathered after traveling back to the shoreline rather than only from the island. Jay identified a few types from the Lostland forests, and began to sort them out from the pile accordingly. As the sunlight began to wane and disappear in the thick fog, Jay pulled a few of his skeletons off of hunting duty and had a fire constructed. The wood had to be floated across the water, making it harder to light, but thanks to the fire lights, many of the tips still smoldered, and the unnatural ever-burning embers dried out the wood and gave him a warm campfire in no time. As for the light it gave off, Jay wasn't worried about it attracting any threats. The fog was a shield, as much as it was a curtain hiding other threats. Jay murmured to Red, "I'll see what Hagatha's up to tonight. Then we'll see if we need to do something about her." Chapter 355. Buying Time. Mirror Reality 34. Matheson nursed the warp charge, his key to freedom, gently in his lap, as he watched the raging red energy furiously burn against the calm blue energy. Since getting it he spent many hours watching it, learning its ways, meditating on his thoughts. One was as deep as the ocean, the other consuming fire, but neither claimed victory, an eternal struggle, as long as it sat in the jade green container. The calm never quells the rage. But the rage can't overcome it. The silent depths holds its own resilience, he thought. But did giving up myself make me like either? Stashing the warp charge away, Smiley gave one last glance at a drip coming from the wall. The constant tapping was unaudible at first, but over the last few days it became louder. Every drop another poke in his mind, another shout in his ear, slowly driving him insane. He knew the tiny, insignificant droplets would either drive him forward or cause his destruction. With warp charge in hand, he left his pathetic dwelling and slipped out of the academy grounds unnoticed, towards the bamboo demon dungeon. After a quick scan of the surrounding forest to make sure there were no witnesses, he approached the entrance. He carefully placed the warp charge down and steeled himself, clenching his grip around his blade as he slowly pulled the sword out. It was nothing compared to the flame sword he wielded, but to him, that ruby gem masterpiece was just another crutch. They can take my sword. I'll give them my name. But they'll never take my indomitable spirit, for within my soul, an unwavering flame burns brighter than any possession or birthright. Sliding his foot back, he pulled the blade back. Crack burrrr. A rumble of thunder broke from its gilded cage. A blue storm broke free, filled with arcs of red lightning. The tip of the blade melted away. Smiley's hair raised. He jumped back, sensing danger as the energy began to sear the ground around it. The dungeon entrance responded, cracking open with another rumble and a gale of wind. Smiley's eyes widened as he watched a portal form. Blue in the center, a ring of crackling red power around the outside. This chapter was first shared on the NEOV Euros LS Set 1N platform. His only chance at escape was here. He was well aware of the consequences, the chance this may cause his death, and he accepted them wholeheartedly. Ignoring all caution, he jumped right in, as quickly as he did so when he entered the mirror reality. Smiley felt his skin burn, his body torn and put back together, but after a moment he landed on solid ground. Huff huff huff. Blood trickled down his arms and dripped off his sword. He felt pain like this before, but grit his teeth and fought back against it, while his body healed itself. Smiley heard a creak in the shadows, a bamboo forest surrounded him. A familiar wooden demon came charging but was cut down, disappeared into nothingness. He grit his teeth and threw his partly melted sword on the ground. Before him. Smiley looked around, his eye winced as he noticed he was back in the bamboo demon dungeon. Behind him, the portal to the mirror reality was already closing. He watched as it shrank and disappeared into nothingness. He grit his teeth and threw his partly melted sword on the ground. He clenched his fists and held them at the sides of his head as he closed his eyes, his face scrunching in painful anger as he knew he had failed, though he didn't shout or curse in fury. Another demon approached, but instead of picking up his sword, Smiley glared at it, his killing intent causing it to halt in its tracks, if only for a moment. The demon lunged forward, its splintered-covered claws lashing. Smiley lunged back with as much speed, sending his fist into its jagged face, cutting open his knuckles. He grabbed whatever part of its body he could and began to crunch his fists into its body. "GRH!" he screamed, ignoring the pain in his hands. "Grah! Grah!" he yelled in the demon's face as his bleeding fists drove into its body, ignoring the pain. His fury outmatched the demon, making it seem as helpless as a straw scarecrow, while its body turned to smaller and smaller splinters. Even as it crumbled and fell he kept pummeling, separating its body into pieces even after it died. After a moment of silence he finally stopped, leaning down on his knees with his blood-covered fists propping him up. Sweat ran into his eyes and began to pull up like tears. Anyone else would have cried pitifully, but not him. Smiley's face turned back to an empty stare. He wiped his sleeve across his eyes, stood up, patted the dirt from his knees, and the splinters off his clothes. You failed. Try again. Again, and again. He whispered, and stashed his half-melted sword into his inventory before leaving the dungeon. Outside, he glanced around the entrance. Even the melted scorched marks that the warp charge had disappeared. It was like it never happened. The only thing different were that some dark cracks had appeared in the fake sky, but it was nothing he hadn't seen before. Smiley knew he was back in the mirror reality, and slipped into the forest, then back to his basement room where he cleaned himself up. He gave one last glance at the dripping wool as he lay in his bed, closing his eyes. But instead of it bothering him, he felt there was something soothing about it as it lulled him to sleep. Loki grinned as he held the ornamental hair clip in his hand, reading the engraving on its underside, which read Heather's name in cursive writing. It was easy for him to snatch it, using his switching power to swap it with an ordinary one. With her special hair clip, he knew he could enlist her powers to help him bargain with Smiley. Like Loki, Heather was someone as insignificant as he was, so there was no one she could turn to for help until he would offer his hand to aid her in finding the hair clip he had stolen. Her powers were to separate something into different forms, breaking them down into distinct parts. For example, she could turn a bronze spoon into 2 smaller spoons of copper and tin, or a bamboo demon into a pile of wood and a harmless demonic shade. However, without its physical body, she had no way to kill a shade, making her power quite redundant, even when used on other dungeon monsters. However, Loki was sure she could harness her powers and separate the 2 energies inside the warp charges, separating them into their blue and red parts for Smiley to experiment with. Of course, Loki had no clue if any of it would work, and he wondered if Smiley would even succeed with the first warp charge, but none of that mattered. It was all just another bargaining tool to him. As for the next steps of his plan, he planned to steal 2 more warp charges this very night. Normally taking one was risky enough, but it seemed that the academy staff were distracted with something else, and a number had left to investigate the forest and the teleport staging area, leaving their warp charges with even less security than usual. Pocket Dimension, Message Relay STATION. Between the real world and the mirror reality, a pocket dimension existed, filled with nothing but frozen white mountains and blizzards. Apart from the sheer icy cliffs and snowstorms, only one building stood here. A grand, lonesome tower with no doors or entrances stood against the endless storm, which functioned as a message relay between the mirror reality and the real world. The very same relay station that Anya's father, Sullivan, had sent his It began only as a vague shimmer, but its curved details and window frame were starting to show themselves. Something, or someone, was trying to connect with either the pocket dimension, the mirror reality, or the real world. Of course, he fought it. His robes began to sway as he waved his arms into a spell, fighting back against whatever this was, chanting the spell until the shimmers of the 3rd window would disappear. He only had to weave the spell once per week, but as the shimmering became stronger, the spell became a daily practice. The old wizard wondered if he was truly stopping it, or merely buying time. Chapter 356. Swordsmith. Higathus Swampius Land. Jay held his hands over the fire, warming them while listening to the occasional crackles. The ends of the logs dripped and bubbled a sap ooze as the moisture was forced out. While the fire burned away, Red and archers had been busy. A number of rat-sized moths occasionally swooped towards the light, annoying their master in doing so. That was enough to seal their fate, being cut in 2 or plunging themselves into the flames and setting themselves ablaze. A small family of cat-sized slugs had also made its way over, attracted to the light, their slimy forms displeasing Jay, and were just as easily cut apart and tossed back to the slimy water they crawled from. Jay's half-opened eyes relaxedly watched as Red's Asane arming sword waved through the air, but began to frown as he watched. The reach of its blade was barely high enough to find the swooping moths. "You guys need new swords," he murmured. He had been calling their weapons swords, as they were suitable to their smaller bodies at the time, but the skeletons were more or less human-sized now, and the Asane swords were really just larger versions of the bone daggers he'd crafted. Heavy daggers, their blades were much wider and shorter than other swords he'd seen adventurers using, so at the edge of the fire he began to mold some bones together. "I'll only need one, then the skeletons can make molds of it," he thought. Using his practice from crafting spears, he easily formed a shaft as long as his shoulder to his fingertips. He gripped one end with his necrotic gauntlet, knowing the skeletons would need to wield it comfortably with armor in the future, then added a crossguard just above his armor-clad thumb, and a thickened pommel just below his grip. After a few swings, he thought it felt good enough, but he improved it by making the grip into an oval shape rather than a cylinder, which fit more comfortably in his hand. The oval shape also helped him to hold the sword at a particular angle, which would help when adding each side of the double-edged blade. This way, when holding the sword, he wouldn't even have to look at the blade to know which way. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0v3 liters B1N. Next came the edges of the blade itself. He took a more tender approach, and as he slowly seeped his necrotic mana into it, condensing the bone material into a harder form of bone before flattening it and shaping its razor edges. In his older weapons, he ignored that some parts of the bone weapons retained the honeycomb structure and other parts of the bones they were made from, since it made them lighter, but now he opted for strength, knowing his skeletons could handle the extra weight. After some refining, he had his first full-length one-handed sword, shorter than Handy's two-hander, but just as wieldy. Jay gave it a few swings at some of the scorching logs, sending clouds of embers as it battered the fire. Nice, Jay said, looking at the sword's silhouette with the flames behind it, a gleam coming off its hardened shell as if it had been polished. He planted his feet down and lowered into a combat stance, swinging it with full force, but as he struck the wood the sword shook, vibrating so much that his hands screamed at him to loosen his grip. Damn it. The honeycomb parts of the bones must have been dampening the vibration before, he said, holding the brittle blade in one hand and tapping the end with his gauntlet, feeling each vibration in his grip. It was easily to tell that it was prone to shattering, so using it as a template, he designed a second version. The second version was the same in every way except for the very beginning of the process. Jay used some of the stronger blue-silt wolf bone and formed another shaft, but made it skinnier than the first sword. He encased the cobalt blue shaft in the white bone, bringing it to the same size as the first shaft he made with the brittle sword, then repeated every other step except one. This time, he didn't condense the outer white bone as much as he had previously, guessing that it would help to absorb some of the vibration, as well as making it less prone to shattering. The sword would get much of its strength from the internal blue shaft. Because he removed excess white bone to flatten and sharpen the blade, a blue hue emerged as the blade went along, and ended in a piercing blue tip, which gave it a unique look. I think you should take a look at. Jay smiled as he held it up, pleased with the look of it, as well as that the stabbing end would also be the much stronger blue bone too, which would stop the slender point from snapping. As for the weight of the blade, it was slightly lighter than the first brittle one he had crafted, but there was one drawback to the sword. It's a little too advanced for the skeletons, he thought, and neither did he want to share from his stockpile of precious silt wolf bone, so he quickly thought of a workaround. The skeletons can just condense a shaft of the white bone to make a stronger internal core, then form the rest of the sword around the outside. Jay summoned Dark to return so it could carve a mold into the ground, then began to teach, or see, if Red was actually capable of condensing bone. Melting it to a liquid was one thing, but forcing it into a pressurized shape was another entirely, and he wouldn't be surprised if it was beyond the skeletons to do so. While Dark returned, Red began to learn from Jay and practice alongside its master. At first, Red didn't seem to understand what Jay wanted. It crafted a bone shaft that was similarly sized to Jay's, but only realized the differences after it wielded the condensed bone, feeling its heavier weight. Thankfully it only needed a tip from Jay to add more mana, and to squeeze the semi-liquid bone tightly, to get rid of any bubbles or cartilage that may have mixed in, and in no time it had a condensed bone shaft. Good, Jay said, glad there were no problems. After Dark returned and dug out a mold, he guided Red through the rest of the sword-making process, modifying it slightly to help the skeleton craft it using the dirt mold technique. The resulting sword was exactly how Jay wanted. He only had to sharpen some of the edges and remove some bumps that the dirt mold caused, but otherwise he was content as he swung the final version of the blade. Skeletal sword level 2. 11 damage, slashing, piercing. Lifespan requires necrotic essence to maintain its form. Current lifespan, 96 hours. Not bad, Jay said with a nod. He expected it to be level 3, but it was a product that a skeleton had made, so he was more or less happy with it. Jay remembered that his Asane arming swords did 12 damage, but those were made from purely silt wolf bone and level 3, so in a way, this was still an upgrade, which he contributed to his new design choices. Jay had 3 new swords now. The brittle one, the blue core one, and the final design that Red crafted. Checking the stats of his blue core sword, it did 13 damage, but was still level 2. He melted the brittle sword back to bone, kept the blue one for himself, and handed the new skeletal sword back to Red. You've earned it. Jay winked. The skeleton ceremoniously bowed, accepting its new sword, and began killing the rat moths with renewed fury. But Jay wasn't done. Blue, return to me. You've got some swords to craft, Jay ordered, deciding Blue and Red could do the rest of the work in upgrading his minions' armaments, and that teaching more skeletons to make weapons would only benefit him in the long term. Chapter 357. Necrotic Circulation. Jay sat by the fire as he watched Dark dig out a few more sword molds under his supervision. Red glanced over every free moment, seeming discouraged at having to lend its new sword back for the molds, or so Jay guessed. But his guess was better than any, as he had been gaining a sense of his skeleton's attitudes over the last few weeks, if one was brazen enough to suggest such abominable creatures even had feelings. Before Blue returned, Dark had finished 3 molds in total. With no other orders, it joined the skeletons in slaying rat moths, keeping them from bothering their supreme by the edge of the fire. Jay admired how Dark preferred to stick to the edge of the light, wavering between the border of the shadows, as it cut open its fluttering enemies. Its bones were stained a few shades darker from the corrupting swamp water, giving it extra stealth, but the necrotic mana that permeated through its body betrayed it. Dark's green beady eyes were like 2 glowing fireflies caught in a romantic dance as they darted about in the darkness. It could control them to shine less at the expense of some of its shade vision, but the biggest betrayal of its stealth was under the skeleton's ribsage. At the heart of all Jay's larger skeletons was a binding pool of necrotic mana holding them together. Dark, come over here, Jay said. The dagger-wielding skeleton appeared and Jay crouched down, looking under his ribs. Like all the other level 3 skeletons, it had a small lobe of glowing necrotic mana in its chest, a heart that didn't beat. Small tendrils branched out from it like a poisonous growth, going to the inside of the ribs, into the shoulder blades, and down the spine towards the legs, all of them entering the bones at various points and disappearing underneath, giving the creature its life. A slightly thicker artery went up along the spine and into the skull, where there was the familiar glistening flickers of intelligence, a mesh of mingling stars of green lights, speeding back and forward like a nest of hungry ants. Jay knew it was a necessity for his creations, keeping them held together, making the inanimate, lifeless bones into functioning parts of its own body. He guessed that the smaller skeletons must have needed less of these internal strings of life, and could mostly hide it within the bones themselves, which meant that larger skeletons would need larger mana circulation, becoming more apparent the larger they became. Red, Jay said, pointing at his side. He dismissed Dark, and the level 5 skeleton sprang over. He stashed its shining armor away and checked over his skeletal body. Thought so, he murmured to himself, seeing a larger lobe. The branching tendrils spreading from it were not only thicker, but more numerous. The only comparison Jay had were the endless trees he had marched underneath, all separating to smaller and smaller branches, until spreading their leaves and vying for a sliver of light. The thicker artery trailing up its spine was slightly different, as it was flatter with an indentation running along the middle, and Jay guessed it would separate into 2 arteries as Red leveled up. Perhaps even 3, given enough time. As Jay gave Red back its armor and it covered the glowing heart, he had an idea, and took out an old cloak from his inventory. He had tore up his coat after replacing it with the Molotov coat, but he still had this cloak, which he once planned to use evading the Losland guards during the Dark. He ordered. The skeleton returned from the edge of the shadows again, and received a new gift from its master, unique and different from any weapons or armor the other skeletons had attained. Wear it. And don't let it get damaged, Jay said, handing over the dark cloak. Dark nodded back, and tenderly rubbed its clawed bone fingers over the fabric, before trying to put it on. It needed some help from Jay as it tried to don the cloak, but afterwards it gave Jay another nod, followed by a deep bow. Jay smiled, seeing how appreciative the small skeleton was of this small gift. Take good care of it. And no more hunting the firelights for you, he said, not wanting it to come back with a tattered cloak filled with burned holes. For the time being the cloak was too big for the skeleton, coming down below its hip bones, but it was only a matter of time until it grew into its full form, and Jay was sure this would help it gain its assassin class, something he'd been encouraging it to pursue. As Dark slipped back into the darkness, he narrowed his eyes and slowly nodded, finding it harder to track the skeleton with his eyes. The only signs of it were the sounds of its blade tearing through the air, or whenever it turned its deathly eyes back to the light. I think you should take a look at. Such a small thing helped a lot, Jay thought, noting that even the insignificant things could pay off. A splash of water sounded as Blue returned from the abyss, and with Dark and archers protecting Jay, both Blue and Red began to craft the new swords, while Jay watched from the edge of the fire. Red clacked its jaws, stared into Blue's eyes, pointed around, and waved its new sword. Jay raised a brow as he saw Red hand its sword over, so Blue could test it, then together they began to craft. Red formed the condensed sword cores, while Blue handled the rest, using its larger mana pool to do most of the mana work. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at N0V3L bin. Jay patiently waited at the fireside, and decided to cook some of the mushrooms that archers had gathered earlier. Of course, he stuck to the ones he had identified, while the unidentifiable ones lay in a pile closer to the ramp of his one-room house. The familiar aromas of the juicy mushrooms made him salivate, and he feasted on them without worry, filling his stomach with gladness, but a part of him missed the practice of sitting down at a table, eating his meal from a plate, instead of the old sausage skewer he cooked it with. He reminisced of the times he ate at his quiet butchery while watching the field nearby, the mist sheep appearing and vanishing in and out of their herd cloud of foggy families. Then he thought of the other times he haggled with their shepherd for a fair price. I wonder how Tremley's going. He's probably claimed the butchery for himself by now unless those bastards killed him, he thought. Jay chewed into another juicy piece, feeling the watery juices spread across his tongue, and cast the thoughts aside. Blue, send one of your sub-skeletons north. Scout and see if they're getting closer, Jay ordered, addressing a pang of worry that had been growing in his heart. Blue nodded back to Jay, then went back to sword molding. His 5 little skeletons were away hunting the firelights, but sending one off to scout was as easy as a thought. After a while, Blue presented its crafts to Jay. 3 new swords. Jay inspected each of them, looking for any imperfections, but he was surprised to see that it made the pommel slightly smaller, while the crossguard slightly pointed upwards. You changed it. Are you sure you want them like this? Jay asked, raising a brow, and Blue nodded back. Jay shrugged. If you're happy, then nice work, he said, and only had to point out a few other details on the sword, showing some parts of the blade to be slightly thicker along the sharpened edges, which Blue quickly fixed. Jay checked over the sword's stats one last time and nodded, seeing they were as strong as the one Red crafted. He also gripped the sword in one hand, and tapped the end with his gauntlet, glad that there was little vibration in his grip. Good. Keep one for yourself, give one to Sweeper, and the other to Lamp if it even wants it, Jay said, doubting that the skin suit wearing skeleton would want to switch from its dagger and shepherd staff combo. Blue bowed, grabbed a sword and caused Jay to smile as it copied him, tapping the end of the sword with its skeletal knuckle. It grabbed the other 2 and stopped by Higatha's shack, handing one sword to Sweeper before slipping away into the waters. The only skeletons left without the new swords were Handy, Heavy, Dark, archers, and the 7 sub-skeletons of Red and Blue. Heavy was still too small to wield the new swords, and currently guarded the underwater bridge with Red's 2 guardian skeletons, posted there as Jay doubted it was fast enough to catch the firelights. Handy, Red, Dark and archers guarded the island, while the others were on light hunting duty. Most of the skeletons were too small for these new swords, and only Dark and Handy were the exception, as Dark dual-wielded daggers and Handy had crafted its own 2-handed sword. With the upgrades complete, Jay sent Sweeper to watch over Azra, so that Dark would go back to monitoring Higatha, leaving it with one simple instruction that he whispered. Try to hide your presence. Chapter 358. Longing. Azra rose to see shafts of light across the floor, coming through the shrunken wallboards. Sweeper stood at her side, his eyes staring at her every moment, but she ignored the skeleton and got up from the table. Walking outside, she raised a brow as she saw the fire, then noticed the other skeletons behind it, standing in front of a large white cube. Bob's been busy, she thought, and walked over. The armored skeleton locked its eyes on her as she drew near, but never raised its sword, even as she passed by the fire, and pulled open the door of the bone cube house. Inside, she found Jay, his feet resting up on a bone desk and a book in his hands, a luminous orb and a black orb next to him. Despite being in the swamp, he seemed so relaxed, which was simply infuriating. While she was suffering in Higatha's shack, being touched and smelling the smells, he was here enjoying himself, reading a book. What are you doing? She asked, frowning. Huh? Jay asked, tilting his head to the side. Azra didn't know what to say. How could she complain? How could she ask for help from a husk? She glanced at the bed and sat down. It was a low-grade swag, like half a mattress, but compared to the rotting wooden table, it was like a taste heavenly clouds cushioning her backside. Jay watched her sit but remained silent. I can't believe you had this, and you let me sleep in the damn dirty shack. Jay scratched his chin. Oh, my bad. He shrugged, and went back to reading the immortal book. Azra stared at him, expecting something more, perhaps a sorry groveling, but he gave her nothing. She groaned, then flopped herself back onto the bed, closing her eyes for a moment. "How's your wound?" "Nearly healed," Jay asked, but didn't take his eyes away from his book. "It's okay. One more should do." "Good. We can probably leave tomorrow then," Jay said. He pulled out the blood compass for a moment and checked its direction, noting that it pointed somewhere south before stashing it away again, then turned to Azra. "I'll check on Higatha soon. Are you excited to return home? Back to your family?" he said. Azra scoffed. "Family?" She shook her head. "We'll see." Jay decided not to ask more. Azra stretched, got up from the bed, then stood in the doorway, looking over the fire and the skeletons. "Do you control them directly? Or do they choose to serve you?" Azra asked. Jay sensed an opportunity to misinform Azra. He wasn't sure if it would yield end results in the future, but the opportunity was here. He hid a smile and kept his voice level as he replied, "They can do what they want, but each of them chose me as their master. They're as free to disobey as you are. I'm actually surprised they haven't tried to kill you," he said, shrugging. Azra's eyes widened and stepped back from the doorway. "I think you should take a look at." "What?" "You don't. Don't worry. I can always unsummon those who disobey. But the others wouldn't like that." He shrugged, still reading his black book. "Besides, I prefer it this way," Jay said. Jay's face was straight, but inwardly he was smiling. He already began to see advantages to this lie. It would make him blameless if he ordered a skeleton to attack a pesky vampire. Azra otherwise. "Oh, okay. Well, keep me on their good side," Azra said, stepping back into the doorway. "Don't worry. I think Sweeper loves guarding you." Jay nodded. "Good. Thank you, Sweeper," Azra said to the skeleton just outside the door. "By the way, do you need any blood?" "Yes," she said, and glanced at Red. "Yes, please." Jay stashed his book away and Azra began to feed. She noticed the gross bump of parasites in Jay's arm, but decided it was something the upper vampires could fix if they even let her keep Jay around. As she sipped his sweet blood, she thought it kind of made sense that Bob was level 4 and could control so many skeletons of similar level they were not being controlled at all. Each were willing servants, and she wondered what it was about Bob that inspired such loyalty. Jay resisted the urge to pat her pristine black hair. When she fed, something seemed intimate about it. Not sexual, but nurturing. He hadn't been touched by someone in a long time, not that something as simple as a hug was intimate, but the need for human connection gnawed at him. The desire to reach out and caress her hair, hold her hand, was a powerful temptation. But Jay knew that crossing that line could lead to consequences he wasn't ready to face. As for other connections he'd had, they were superficial and fleeting. Some were even done out of social obligation, and he doubted most people even wanted to shake his hand. He pondered why he even had this yearning, questioning the depths of his own longing. Was it the primal need for closeness, for the reassurance that he was not alone in this soul-crushing world? Or was it something more complex, a desire to bridge the emotional chasms that separated him from others? Either way, it was too late. Past experiences had taught him the painful lessons of misplaced trust and shattered expectations. For a moment he thought that perhaps it was the bittersweet longing itself that held the most profound beauty, unrivaled by love or hate, but he cast those thoughts aside. "Red, stand in the door and stare at Azra. Raise your sword and hold it up until she leaves," Jay ordered, and Red came inside. "I have work to do and you'd better leave." "I think Red is jealous," Jay said, tapping her shoulder and pointing at Red. Okay," Azra said, stood up, glanced at the bed, and quickly left. "If you want something to do, there's some mushrooms outside. I know you can't eat them, but let me know if they taste any good," Jay called out, and Azra waved her hand. "Red, stay in the doorway," Jay ordered. "That lie's already paying for itself." All right, time to spy on Higatha, Jay thought, and leaned back on his chair. Chapter 359. Manipulation. Higatha didn't know that Jay could see through the eyes of the skeletons. Even Azra didn't know about the little trick. Sure, something the skeletons behaved oddly, looking around curiously as if they had minds of their own, but it was something that the women had passively or subconsciously accepted without much thought. If they mimicked humans in some way, it didn't raise any concerns. Their thinking was too human-centered. As Jay entered the eyes of dark, he froze, finding it hard to believe what he saw, much less make sense of Higatha's true powers. The black altar was still partly melted from when she had added the breaking shards to it, and inhaled their powers, but now, without the shards, she conducted a different ritual. On top of the altar, a clay jar was sitting, the same type that lined the walls of the room. But it was empty, with a lid at its side, and Higatha chanted in a sickening sweet voice that betrayed her form. "Come now, tender ones, I have a world to show you. Filled with children and things to destroy just a little deeper, hidden in the forest. Come, there are many magical treasures, just a little deeper, some powerful enough to open the break, to tear it apart." Above the altar, a black fog began to spew forward from a dark portal, see trails of thick smoke. The black fog condensed and seeped into the altar. The holes that the breaking shards had melted into began to fill and repair themselves, and suddenly an ethereal being appeared, a dark ghost of a child's face. Higatha sprung her arms up, each hand shuddering as she fought for control. The ghost's face twisted in anger, and turned into a physical form as its power was challenged. Its being began to be ripped apart. Jay felt more disgusted as he watched the ghostly child separate into a flaming light, and a handful of leaves. Some of the leaves were charred, causing the face in the flaming light to cry in pain. Higatha moved one hand and the flame floated into the jar, which she quickly sealed up. As for the leaves, she had them under her own control, and each of them floated to the mirror and disappeared, undoubtedly becoming another part of the rotting walls and roof. Higatha's face dripped with sweat, and more of her moles and skin bumps surfaced again, returning to her grotesque body. She grabbed the clay jar and placed it alongside the others. Dark continued to watch from the shadowy corners of the room, looking around at the hundreds of jars on the walls. Jay barely kept himself from ordering her death in that very moment. Azra still has to be healed one final time, and Higatha didn't begin her ritual again, so he stopped the host's skill and returned to his body. His human skin was crawled with fury, itching with spite. That witch. That disgusting witch. She had the fucking nerve to have me hunt those firelights. All along she was the one creating them and to use children. Jay grit his teeth, his fists clenching. Jay felt like he had become a part of her plans, another manipulated pawn, and he wasn't sure if she was human children, but using children of any kind disgusted him. "Stop hunting the lights. Return to me but remain hidden from Higatha and Azra's sight." Woody Sori played in his head. The thought of being manipulated in any way, no matter how small, was infuriating. And by such a dumb woman that could barely string sentences together. He wondered if that was just part of an act she played. Jay looked over the runes in his desk once more, noting the one needed to scratch away to stop Higatha's mirror portal from working. But he looked up from the desk. Azra was right, he thought, and left to the shack. Jay remained outside, knowing his presence was enough to get Azra to come out, and whispered through the rickety old door. "Azra, you're not safe here. Come back to my room." Sweeper opened the door, and Azra stepped out behind it. She had a cheeky grin on her face. "That's a little bold of you, don't you think?" Azra whispered. "I think you should take a look at." Jay shook his head, turned and walked back with Azra following. He was committed to killing Higatha, but didn't let his anger show, lest Azra give Higatha any clues, so when he got to the edge of the fire, he changed the topic. "How were those mushrooms? Did you sample any?" Jay asked. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via Novelbin. "Disgusting. That was the last time I try any husk food. I'm sure they weren't that bad. But can you even eat human food?" "I can taste it, but would vomit it up if I swallowed any. Our stomachs don't do solid food. But I can drink most of the things husks do." "Like soup?" Jay raised a brow. Azra tiled her head to the side and glanced at him. The answer was an obvious no. Jay gently smiled and looked back into the fire, which the skeletons had maintained with a small pile of wood at its side. "So, am I supposed to stay here now? You don't trust Higatha anymore?" Azra asked. "I never trusted her." Jay sighed. "She's just more dangerous than I realized," he murmured. Azra smiled. "Like I said," she said with a shrug. Jay sent Sweeper to retrieve the new leather blanket from the table, and stashed it in his inventory when he returned, and Azra's curious expression didn't escape his gaze. "You can sleep in my bed during the daytime. I'll sleep in it at night. Unless that's below you, but I have a feeling it's a huge upgrade from the moldy table." Azra looked at the skeletons, "If that's okay with them." All of you nodded Azra. The skeletons all nodded, and Red bowed, causing Azra to smile. "Looks like they've accepted you, though I wouldn't test the extent of their loyalty. They never like that," Jay said. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks." Just like Higatha toyed with Jay, he toyed with Azra, but it was beginning to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. The thought of being in any way like that swamp witch disgusted him. His safety was a priority, but he felt that he took things too far, and that some of his tricks and lies were completely unnecessary, their ends only resulting in a twisted satisfaction that caused his own blood to stink. The swamp waters had begun to recede, and the highest prodding bones of the skeletal bridge was beginning to show itself, emerging from the abyssal depths. With Azra relatively safe, Jay returned to his bed, and before closing his eyes, he gave Blue a final order. Blue, you can take a few skeletons to hunt swamp creatures. The unassigned ones. Leave Red, Sweeper, Dark and Archers with me. Chapter 360. Unstable World. Mirror Reality 34. Loki had been busy. During the day, he manipulated Heather into helping him, and during the night, he stole 2 more warp charges. Little did the majority of the sleeping students know that the faculty staff had went on high alert and swarmed around the academy and all its facilities. The mirror reality had become unstable, with only one bridge linking it back to the real world. While the reality seemed stable on the inside, it was barely holding on to its link to time and space, which gave rise to anomalous activity. Low appeared gravity in some areas, high gravity in others. Time fluctuation, light stuttering, and temperature changes were the least of the threats. The most dangerous parts were pure black fractures that appeared, each of them void and filled with nothingness. A single misstep and your foot would disappear as if it had never existed, painless until you realized your leg had become a stump gushing blood. Even the temple robes couldn't protect one from these voids of shattered darkness. The temple robes were a product of the Second Academy. Each of them were covered in elaborate runes and shifting patterns that flowed around the robes, swaying and moving as if they were living paintings. There were enough for the staff to each adorn one, but not for the students. Not a student, but an unwilling servant, Smiley was forced from his sleep and given a robe, ordered to patrol and mark out areas that were unstable. However, he couldn't be more thrilled. Smiley thought that the faster this false reality broke down, the better. It would serve to bring him one step closer to the real world, and if he could break this world, he would do it. Consequences be damned. As he walked through the forest near the academy, he had one destination in mind: the Bamboo Demon Dungeon. He kicked stones as he went, and some froze, hovering in the air, while others shot off faster than a bolt of lightning. The origin of this chapter's debut can be traced to N0V3 liters B1N. These things are quite useful, Smiley murmured, watching the patterns on his temporal robe wave wildly in one moment, then slow to a near stop the next. As he approached the dungeon entrance, he noticed something odd. The damage he had caused with the first warp charge appeared again, flickering in and out of existence. It was like it couldn't register what was real as it tried to mirror the real world, but lost connection and reverted back to the damaged state that the warp charge had left it in. Smiley threw a rock towards it, and it landed just as the damaged entrance appeared. Then, the rock began to flicker with the rest of it, unsure of its own existence. At Smiley's feet, the very same rock appeared again, as if it had never been grabbed and tossed away, causing Smiley to frown. A little too risky, Smiley thought, casting aside ideas of entering the dungeon. On the way back towards the academy, he made sure to mark every unstable area, and even went a step further, adding a marker each time the robe's patterns so much as shifted or waved slightly. Smiley didn't know for certain that he had caused this, at least in part, but he guessed it was likely, and he had no problem with continuing his plans. What fault am I at, if I were to collapse this world with everyone in it? I'm nothing but a slave. They don't all give me orders, some are innocent, but they're all complicit in my unwilling servitude. They may have their reasons to keep me here, for their own safety, but I won't pay that price for them, Smiley thought. He pitied those who lived here, who were ignorant of his situation, but he counted them as weak. In this world, and the real world, only the strong would cease their survival, gripping it with unyielding madness, until their flesh tore from their fingers, never loosening their resolve, even for a moment. As he planted markers down, he made a winding trail of safety, like a filter, and he began to see every trial and lesson like that, a filter, separating the wheat from the chaff, the strong from the weak. Even the academy is like that. A filter of intelligence and strength. Only the strong, the resolved, and the crafty make it through to the end. If only they knew they were being filtered out with every meager step they took. Perhaps they would study harder, Smiley thought. But only those who make it hold the right to rule. If they can't push themselves to greatness, they have no right to rule others. Smiley solidified his resolve, determined to never give up, to use every ounce of willpower he had to make sure he succeeded. After a night of patrolling and marking out the unstable areas, most of the staff were relieved of their duty when morning came. The students were prohibited from leaving academy grounds until after a grand assembly, where they were briefed on the situation, and told not to go near any of the markers they had laid. The students whispered and chattered, confused and frightened, and after the assembly, most refused to leave the academy grounds, since the academy castle was reinforced against the instability. I think you should take a look at. Of course, Loki dared to leave, and with Heather in tow. She still had to hold up her end of the deal she had with Loki, who had brought her sentimental hair clip back. Promises were hard things to break, especially promises made to someone as cunning as Loki. She still didn't know that Loki was the one who had stolen the hair clip in the first place. As they approached an older building, Loki stopped. "Wait here," he whispered, and then went inside. Loki brazenly went down the basement steps, uncaring if he would disturb Smiley's sleep, but as he got to the bottom, he saw a Smile as cunning as he was. "Have you got another?" Smiley asked. "2 more. For 6 levels." Loki replied. "Deal. Hand them over." "Levels first." Smiley scoffed. "We did levels first last time. This time, the charges first. 1 charge now, the other later." Smiley circled around Loki, blocking the exit to the stairs. "Both now, or I'll kill you later," Smiley said, standing between the bottom of the stairs and Loki. "Or you could die now and I'll take them off your dead body. It seems that the staff are quite busy, they probably wouldn't find your body for days." Smiley retrieved his sword, the tip was still melted. Loki tilted his head, his eyes narrowing on the melted tip of the sword. "That's new. It should hurt more when I kill you with it." Smiley raised the sword back, about to strike, his killing intent surged, and Loki no longer doubted his madness. "Wait. Here. 6 levels," Loki said, bringing them out of his inventory, trying to keep his hands from shaking while placing them on the ground. 6 levels, Smiley said, and stashed away 2 warp charges, then turned to the stairs. "Wait, you're doing it now?" Loki asked. Smiley turned and glared back. The answer was obvious. Just a second. There's someone who can help. Outside there's a girl called Heather. I think you'll find her powers useful. Take it as a sign of good faith, and I trust you'll uphold your end of the deal." Smiley's eyes softened and looked over Loki, seeing something in the timid man that, perhaps, Loki didn't. "You can come if you'd like," Smiley said, and left up the stairs. Loki scratched his head, and followed shortly after.